Ready, Matthias? Okay, colleagues, welcome. Good afternoon to this next panel, which is on addressing the root causes of dysfunctions in the international financial architecture. It's my pleasure to give the floor to our moderator, my colleague Matthias Bruckner. Matthias, over to you.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to everyone in the room and also to everyone who is joining this panel on addressing the root causes of dysfunctions in the international financial architecture online. So my name is Matthias Bruckner. I am officer in charge of the Secretariat of the Committee for Development Policy here at the United Nations. And it's really a great pleasure to be the moderator of this panel, which is composed entirely of members of the Committee for Development Policy, in short CDP. So maybe for those who do not know about the CDP, it's an organ, it's a formal organ of the United Nations. It's a subsidiary body of the Economic and Social Council, and it consists of 24 independent experts covering a wide range of expertise, backgrounds, and experiences. So most members are academics, development practitioners, former policymakers, and or UN officials, and often it's really this end. They are covering most CDP members have several roles done in the past. So hence, it's a body that really connects academia and development policy experience with the formal policy making within the United Nations, and in that I think it really has a kind of unique function within the UN. So let's move to the objective of this panel, and this panel really starts from the finding that the international financial system does require fundamental reforms to address critical challenges in development financing, and these findings, on one hand, I believe it's a kind of common finding, but it's also a finding on a topic where the CDP has worked on for many, many years. So therefore, in this panel, CDP members will draw on their own research and on the work of the CDP and the expertise to examine key dysfunctions in the current financial architecture and discuss critical reforms needed to create a more responsive and inclusive development financing system. So the proposals you will hear, they range from strengthening global and regional institutional cooperation, financing of public goods by multilateral development banks, new market intervention mechanisms by the International Monetary Fund, fiscal policy alignment to align social protection with fiscal policy objectives, and to enhance trade finance. So with that, let's move to introduce the panelists. To the right, I have Sakiko Fukudapa. She's professor at the New School here in New York in the United States, and she's not only a long-serving member of the CDP, she's also the current chair of the CDP. So very much welcome, Sakiko. To my left, actually, we're expecting Jose Antonio Ocampo, who is also professor. He's professor here at the School for International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He is also the chair of the International Commission of Experts on Financing for Development. He is also a longtime CDP member, and he had previously been the chair of CDP. Unfortunately, he was supposed to arrive here this morning, but his flight got canceled, so he was trying to make alternative arrangements. We're still hoping that he arrives in time. If that's not the case, then we will try to fill in somehow. Apologies for that. And then online, we will be joined with Liliana Rojas Suarez. She is the director of the Latin America Initiative and is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., and she is also CDP member. And then we have Trudy Hartzenberg. She is the executive director of the Trade Law Center for Southern Africa, in South Africa. And then last but not least, we have Annalisa Pritzon. She is a principal research fellow at the think tank ODI Global, in the United Kingdom. So we wanted in this panel, we wanted to go around, have first interventions of around 6 to 7 minutes each, and then turn to questions from the floor. I have not seen message from Jose Antonio, who was supposed to be the first one to speak. I'm not sure if one of my colleagues would be willing or able to summarize, or I could quickly summarize the main points that he had raised. Oh, okay. So apologies for that. So the question I had supposed to ask Jose Antonio was really what he sees as the main gaps in the global financial architecture, and then also to how to involve the regional, to better integrate regional institution into the financial architecture. I think I don't want to, unfortunately, I'm not a spokesperson. I just want to highlight maybe a few points, and then maybe the other panelists could add on this main issue. So if it comes to the first part on the main dysfunction, so the views of Mr. Ocampo was that there is already, so he had provided that the world has created a system of international financial institutions, including the Multilateral Development Banks and the International Monetary Fund, but found it to be weak in two areas, mainly in the areas of debt restructuring and on international tax cooperation. And in that, he viewed that there's a need for a creative, permanent institutional mechanism to facilitate the restructuring of sovereign debts to manage problems of over-indebtedness. And in tax cooperation, he viewed the best reforms would be to transform the UN Committee of Experts on International Tax Cooperation on Tax Matters into an intergovernmental organ, and to strengthen the Secretariat to work in complementary ways with the OECD, and as well to establish a global asset registry to control tax evasion and avoidance. And then, as I said, maybe the other panelists can elaborate on these points if they would wish to. And on the question on the architecture, he stressed that it is essential in all areas to develop a strong multi-level architecture, recognizing that globalization is a world of open regionalism, and therefore that it means that there's a potential complementarity between global and regional entities, as well as competition, which is also seen as healthy. And an additional virtue of an architecture, of this multi-level architecture, would be the strong sense of belonging of smaller and medium-sized countries to regional institutions, which, because they do have a limited voice in the global institution, and that therefore the consequence would be that the actions of these regional institutions may respond more strongly to the interests of these small and medium-sized countries. And lastly, as an architecture of this type exists, in view of Professor Ocampo, in the area of the multilateral development banks, which can undoubtedly continue to improve, particularly by strengthening the cooperation between the World Bank and the regional institutions. And then he calls that such arrangement could be extended to the international monetary system and also to international tax cooperation, where these networks had been more seen as half empty. And for that reason, creating a broader group of regional monetary organizations and regional tax cooperation bodies could be a priorities of the international financial reforms. So this is just as a brief summary of what he had outlined as the main point he would like to have raised. And with that, maybe let's go first online. Let's go to Annalisa Pritzon. I hope she is connected.
Absolutely. Can you see me in the room, and can you hear me?
We hear and see you very well. Thank you very much and warm welcome.
Fantastic, brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could be there in person, and luckily technology is kind of helping us. And Matthias, you've done a great summary of what Jose Antonio would have kind of shared with everyone in the room and online. I would love to elaborate on a number of proposals around the role of multilateral development banks in supporting and financing global public goods and global challenges. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I think it might be easier for me to share from my screen, so give me 1 second for this to happen. I just wanted to triple check with everyone that you can see the presentation. Yes, I can see that you won't see me, but you will see the PowerPoint presentation, and I will be relatively brief. So, in principle, multilateral development banks are really well placed to finance and provide solutions to global challenges. Why I'm saying this in principle? Because first of all, they're either regional or global reach. They have offices at the country level, means they have a kind of a broader spectrum of perspectives, and also they can share learning across client countries. The second point is their staff is directly involved, is highly experienced when it comes to project negotiation and design. They oversee project implementation, but it's not only about technical assistance downstream, but it's also about advising governments on policy reform. And very importantly, MDBs can also bring, in many cases, financing at scale. And again, in most cases across countries, the financing they provide is actually at better terms than what many individual countries might be able to get from capital markets. But there is inevitably a but. So what are the challenges for MDBs to support regional and global challenges? I think we need to go back to the main kind of point around the business model of MDBs. They were created with a country-based lending model supporting national development. Core challenges were at the heart of the kind of lending model, thinking about the responsibility of finance ministries, and global and regional challenges haven't been part of the core mandate of MDB mandates thus far. There is also an element that comes from the country perspective. So in a lot of work that we've done over the years at ODI, we've seen that there are a number of countries reluctant to borrow when it comes to projects that may support global challenges. Why is that the case? First of all, there is an element around not paying the debt service, for example, for low carbon transition or for building resilience, because they have to pay for the consequences they have not created. But also there's another element. Many of these projects do generate positive externalities. So the benefits might kind of reach beyond the borders of a country. Therefore, when you're kind of servicing the loan, a country might not reap the entire benefits. Therefore, there is usually a kind of a lower level of demand for this type of global public goods. And again, I want to stress it's not just about scaling up MDB lending, but it's also about providing concessional finance, including grant financing for middle-income countries. And we know that concessional finance is a scarce resource at the moment. But the discussion is around solutions. So what can be done? I will try to split this in the next few minutes between financing and operations. So first of all, there is a common challenge. We need bigger MDBs. So we need MDBs with greater lending, and that's about a commitment to the full implementation of the recommendations of the expert panel on the capital adequacy review frameworks of MDBs. It's also kind of a clear recommendation for shareholders to move ahead with capital increases where the headroom of an MDB is limited. It applies to certain MDBs, but not every single MDB. We also need a robust replenishment of concessional windows. And again, this week, there will be the pledging session of IDA in Seoul at the same time. And we need to recall that a number of concessional windows actually offer really good value for money. For example, every dollar that a donor provides to IDA actually can generate up to $4 in terms of lending because of the reflows and the equity IDA has. But in terms of solutions, it's also about identifying incentive structures that can capture positive externalities. The World Bank has already been working on this. Other MDBs are starting or should be considering that. It's about, in other words, embedding the incentive structure to lower the cost of borrowing for countries for projects that have positive externalities. I'm thinking about projects with low carbon transition embedded, but it's also about targeted concessional finance. This is a very kind of limited resource available. It can be deployed even in middle income countries, small amounts for very strategic investment. I'm thinking about, for example, project preparation for low carbon transition projects. But it's also important to recall that the solutions will differ across global challenges. We shouldn't treat them as they were just a single one: climate change mitigation, global public health, fragility. These are the kind of core global public goods that MDBs do provide. And we also need to differentiate between MDBs. We know some of them are very active with certain global public goods. I'm thinking about global public health for the World Bank and the IDB. It might not apply to all MDBs. So I think these are two important clarifications, which leads me to the kind of last slide to reflect on the kind of solutions on operations when it comes to the three global public goods that we outlined in the note. First of all, when it comes to climate change mitigation, there's also a responsibility from MDB staff to advise client countries in their decarbonization pathways. It's about really showing what a low carbon transition might look like. It's around showing scenarios in terms of costs and benefits. So we know that low carbon options might be more expensive at the beginning of the cycle and will have lower maintenance costs down the line versus a fossil fuel project. And we know that also costs in renewable energy are declining at exponential rates. So it's about showing the different scenarios and profiles so finance ministries and environment ministries can take, and energy ministry can take an informed decision. When it comes to global public health, it's about sharing best practice when it comes to governance arrangements and investing the human capital for new technologies within new and existing healthcare organizations. So this is about a lot around the governance and the software side. And when it comes to fragility and conflict, I wish we had a dedicated session on this. I need to be really brief for the sake of time, but it's very much around the flexibility in the policies for a more agile response in conflict and fragile context. But it's also, this does require an informed risk-taking by the board and by the MDB management. But also we shouldn't forget a multidisciplinary approach. And this is a key area where the MDBs and the UN system can really work together. And I'll stop here. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you so much, Annalisa, for this very interesting proposal and discussions on how to get financing for global public goods and to address crisis by using a multilateral development banks, that is, by using existing institutions. For the next topic, I would like to ask on Liliana Rojas Suarez to speak about IMF interventions in bond markets, and that really then goes to how to address systemic liquidity crisis. So the question I would like to propose to Liliana is what type of new mechanism could really address systemic liquidity crisis arising from international financial contagion? And then more specifically, how could an IMF-managed fund be structured to effectively stabilize sovereign debt markets during such liquidity crisis? With that, Liliana.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It's really a pleasure and honor to be in this panel. Fortunately, we don't have Jose Antonio with us, but as Annalisa said, you replaced him very well. So I have a presentation, so let me share my screen with you. If you give me a second, please. So can you see it? I'm assuming that you can see the presentation. All right. So this is a proposal that has been put forward by a group of former policymakers from Latin America, who are now policy makers in some cases also, but in the academia, most of them. It's called CLAF, in Spanish, it's called the Latin America Committee on Macroeconomic and Financial Issues. So what is that we deal for? We deal with a problem that is very well known by everybody. Is the liquidity, the emergence of liquidity crisis in economies that are otherwise solvent. Now, as Matthias said, the proposal deals with the issue of contagion. Why contagion? Because that's something that cannot be avoided. There are always going to be accidents in imperfect capital markets, right? A crisis can start in one country and it could permeate into other countries, affecting the balance sheet of economies, even if they have strong fundamentals. Now, of course, we strongly believe that good policies help to avoid and mitigate the problems of contagions, but have never been able to provide foolproof protection. Still, the contagion component of a crisis is going to take place across countries. Now, in these situations, advanced economies have tools. What they do is they have lenders of last resort central banks. Those central banks have a particular characteristic that emerging markets and developing countries don't. They can issue hard currencies. As you know, every time that there is a systemic liquidity crisis, there is always a flight to safety. And safety, it means to go into currencies that are widely traded, most of the cases towards the US dollar, but also other hard currencies like the euro play an important role. So every time there is a liquidity crisis, in the past, what advanced economies have done, they have issued large amounts of the currencies they issue, okay? In contrast, emerging markets and developing countries, they cannot do that, right? So what they do instead is they rely on a huge accumulation of international reserve that are the currencies issued by advanced economies, okay? So since you cannot issue a currency that is widely demanded, you safeguard yourself by saving in the currencies that are issued by advanced economies. But of course, we all know that accumulating large amount of international reserve are inefficient and very expensive solutions since resources cannot be allocated to other better uses. So what is our proposal, right? So what we identify is this asymmetry, right? There is an asymmetry between countries that issue reserve currencies and countries that do not issue reserve currencies and therefore do not have a lender of last resort in hard currency. So to address this asymmetry, what we propose is the creation of an IMF-managed emerging market fund. We call it the EMF, the Emerging Market Fund. What is the role? Okay, the role here is that every time that there is a liquidity crisis, what you see is a huge collapse of emerging market bonds, which of course, if not corrected quickly, can shift from being a liquidity problem into a solvency problem. So what the objective of the EMF is to avoid those sharp disruptions in emerging market bonds by intervening in the short term on a temporary basis on the bond markets of those countries. Okay, so the idea is basically not to deal with the problem of solvency, but to deal with the contagion effects of a liquidity crisis and intervening in that market to prevent those spikes that are so harmful for the countries. So, what will the IMF do? Well, with a sound governance structure, because governance is very important, and we can talk about that later, and adequate funding, another issue that I'm not going to deal in my first intervention, but we can talk about later too. What the IMF is doing is having the authorization to make temporary, and this word is very important, secondary market purchases of emerging market sovereign debt, right? So these are interventions in the bond market. The IMF, of course, when to intervene, right? Has to decide when to intervene. And so it has to identify when a systemic liquidity crisis starts. And finally, has to identify what is the basket or the index of countries for its intervention. Now, how innovative it is? Well, it depends who you ask, right? Because it is not innovative at all for advanced economies. It's actually an old concept. It's being used continuously, right? The United States, the US Fed, do these interventions not very frequently, but does it every time there is a liquidity crisis through large purchases of treasury securities, right? We all know that both in the global financial crisis and in the COVID-19, the US Fed made huge purchases of treasury securities. Of course, can do it because issue a hard currency. And in Europe also, they have a similar instrument. It's called in the European Central Bank, it's called the Transmission Protection Mechanism, which had exactly the same purpose. Where it is new, where the proposal is new, is for emerging markets. So it's a new proposal for emerging market using advanced economies principles. So, the transmission protection mechanism, I am going to paraphrase what the main objective is, rather than put TPI and put it EMF. And then the role would be to counter disorderly market dynamics that are not guaranteed by emerging market fundamentals. So again, in a nutshell, the EMF is trying to address this issue of a missing hard currency issuing central bank, right? So the emerging markets do not have this hard currency issuer central bank, and that's what the EMF proposal does. Allow for the intervention within a mechanism that is housed at the International Monetary Fund. Now, why is it different? Why is this EMF different from existing IMF instruments? Because the IMF also has instruments for during times of liquidity crisis, right? But there are a couple of very, very important differences. The first one is that EMF interventions are not focusing on specific countries. The objective is systemic. It's a systemic perspective. You see that there is a liquidity crisis, that the bond markets are collapsing, and so it aims to stabilize a market, the emerging market bond market, not individual countries, okay? It's not that you're going to pick and choose and going through a whole process of identify what country need liquidity support. It's just an intervention on the market, preventing the spikes that will lead to potential solvency problems. Huge difference here. It's automatic. The EMF, when it intervenes, does not ask countries, can I intervene in your country? Can I intervene? No, it just intervenes. It's automatic. Countries do not have to decide for its activation, so there's no stigma problems. It's not that the countries go to the IMF requesting an EMF intervention. The EMF, like in advanced economies, decides when to intervene. And it's also readily available when needed. Right? You don't have to go, for example, through the, every time there is a crisis, new instruments are being formed, are being proposed, and there's huge protracted negotiations to allow them to start. In this case, the instrument needs to be set up before the eruption of any liquidity crisis. And finally, it's very important to clarify what the Emerging Market Fund is not. Is not a substitute for other IMF instruments. The EMF complements the IMF toolkit. It's not a substitute for good policies. The idea is not that now we are trying to say, all right, and now we're going to intervene every time there's a problem. No, it's when the market has a problem, not when a specific country has a problem. And therefore, does not deal with solvency issues. This is a mechanism solely designed for liquidity issue problems. All right, that's my initial interventions. I'm sure there's a lot of questions about details, but I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Liliana, for this very, very specific proposal how to address one of these key dysfunctions that the CDP identified and that you are working on. Now let's move the focus a bit to move to a little bit broader discussion probably. So, Professor Fukuda-Pa, what policy measures, if we go to the social and fiscal policy alignment, what policy measures could help countries to create the fiscal space that is necessary for social protections, while at the same time also maintain macroeconomic stability? Sakiko.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in these dialogues. And Matthias, thank you for your question. You say what policy measures can help countries create fiscal space for social protection? Well, there are a number that are quite well known, including progressive taxation, for example, and other domestic and external resource mobilization. But the point I'd like to make is, in fact, that resource mobilization is really not the problem. I mean, not the only problem. The problem that I want to talk about is the fact that there is this gap between resource mobilization and the purpose to which they should be put. Much of the debate, much of the agenda, the elements papers outline many proposals, but most of them are addressing resource mobilization efforts in the aggregate as a sort of a macroeconomic challenge, not their distributive and social consequence or climate consequence. The consequences for achieving the SDGs. And we just have to keep on reminding ourselves that this is a financing for sustainable development. This is a financing for development as outlined in the SDG framework. And so, domestic resource mobilization efforts, of course, are tremendously important, but it's the spending that needs to be aligned with the priorities for achieving the social goals in the SDG framework, as I focus my comments on social protection or social goals, more broadly understood. And this means that there has to be particular attention to equity or the commitment to leave no one behind in the SDG framework. And I would also add that, we need to address root causes and institutional constraints to achieving transformative development. And these require action by multiple stakeholders, both national and international. So I'll give you some examples, specific priorities as I see it. First, increasing domestic revenue mobilization will be essential, but too often governments resort to regressive taxation, such as consumption taxes and other taxes on low-income households. There's increasing political disaffection with such efforts, as illustrated by the demonstrations against tax hikes in Kenya that occurred in June this year. But there are, in fact, considerable opportunities for revenue raising by progressive taxation, such as wealth taxes, as proposed by the G20, tax on corporations and the financial sector, tax on windfall profits, digital services, cryptocurrencies, and others. It's a pity that Jose Antonio is not here. He appears to be on his way, hopefully soon, but because Colombia's multifaceted tax reform that was passed earlier this year is a very good example of what can actually be done to introduce a policy that raises revenues, that's I think estimated at 1.7% of GDP, but also redistributes and reallocates spending to social priorities. It increases taxes on higher income earners. introducing a wealth tax and a levy on exports of oil and coal, and comes with an expansion of social provisions such as in universal health care, education, land reform, and pensions. These are priorities that not only provide a safety net to the vulnerable in times of dire need and emergencies, but reduce the vulnerability of the lower income populations, empowering them to be agents of sustainable development. So this is really an investment as much as a safety net. Another important priority and an example is of this kind of a link between between revenue raising and social goals is on the expenditure side. Priority for social goals include adequate provisions for universal social protection, as well as broader provisions for essential public infrastructure for basic economic and social rights, such as education, health, water, and roads, and so forth, public services and public goods. But expenditures are not distributionally neutral, and more can be done, for example, to introduce effective gender-responsive budgeting systems, reduce subsidies on public bads, such as tobacco. Government policy space is also severely constrained by austerity policies that continue to severely constrain government spending, undermining the achievement of social goals. These policies are increasingly questioned on the grounds of both economic theory and management, and empirical evidence on the persistence of austerity policy conditionalities from international lenders and their negative consequences document these effects. A good example of that is a very exhaustive work by Kentikalinis and Stubbs, 1,000 Cuts, that was published in 2023, that documents years very comprehensively the negative effects of these policy conditionalities. Third, more action is needed by major stakeholders in international finance to address long-standing international institutional arrangements, debt resolution for developing countries, international cooperation to reduce tax avoidance and illicit financial flows, as Matthias, you have mentioned, and implementation of intellectual property regimes for equitable financing and distribution of global public goods such as vaccines. These are all issues on which the CDP has conducted studies and analyses and reported on variously in 2018, 2023, and 2024. This last point about intellectual property brings in the whole question of innovation and science and technology. Increasingly, this is coming into as an explicit item for negotiations in many fora. Very importantly, it was included in the Pact for the Future, and it is one of the elements included in the Financing for Development 4. And there is this broad issue of innovation is so incredibly important in the context of the current age of the knowledge economy, and the value of intangibles. And there is an enormous potential for creating fiscal space for financing access and diffusion of essential public goods through more effective management of intellectual property regimes in domestic legal systems. And that is also within the scope of the TRIPS agreement. I am referring in particular to the to making much more effective and fuller use of the provisions for flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement for this purpose, and the provisions in the TRIPS agreement for all countries to facilitate the transfer of technology. So just to finish for now, I want to highlight how aligning FFD4 agendas with social goals and the SDGs requires addressing public finances holistically, including revenue raising and expenditures, and going beyond financing of social safety nets to a broader set of investments in social priorities. Feminist fiscal policy is a good example of such a holistic approach that addresses gender biases in taxation, gaps in expenditure, such as for care work, and developing a range of policy packages for promoting gender equity and empowerment. All that is part of the social goals of the SDG agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sakiko, for really bringing the question of financing for development, how it's discussed here, into the perspective of sustainable development, on to the linkages, and also going on not just on traditional views, I would say, on financing social protection, but also bringing it in the broader context, linking it to the needed international institutions related to innovation. Thank you very much for that. And with that, let's move to the last panelist. And let's move to the last identified dysfunction here. That's the area of international trade. So with that, I would like to ask Trudy Harzenberg to speak a bit about proposals for addressing dysfunctions in trade and financing for development, and maybe how, more specifically, how can financing mechanisms be strengthened to support trade as an engine for development, particularly for enhancing developing countries' participation in global trade. Trudy.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to join you. I certainly join my colleagues in wishing that I were with you in person there, but I can say it's a bit warmer where I am joining you from this evening. I would like to share with you some thoughts on the trade, finance, industrialization nexus from an African perspective. This is my comfort zone. And of course, on the African continent, there are some extremely important developments, both in terms of promoting intra-Africa trade, but also changing how and in what African countries trade with global partners. And this links very much to the industrialization agenda. Finance and investment, of course, are integral to achieving the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area, where trade, industrialization, finance, and investment really come together. It remains true that the African continent is forward linked into global value chains. The predominant form of enterprise on the continent, as in many other developing regions, is of course the small, medium, and micro enterprises. Women and youth-led enterprises remain seriously marginalized, and this relates also in terms of access to finance. Not only trade finance, but access to finance in different manifestations, startup capital, working capital, and so on. So what are the implications when we take a look at the international financial architecture, the role of multilateral development banks, and here I would like to add regional development banks and national development banks, so looking at development finance in a more comprehensive manner, but also turning to the financial services sector development issues. It remains true that if we take a look at the African continent, financial inclusion remains very uneven and rather weak. A study by the IMF in April this year of 36 African countries concluded that in only 16 of those 36 countries, that more than 50% of adults, men and women, had a bank account. The gender divide is very evident too, with far less women having formal bank services access. And this has important implications for access to finance. We recognize, of course, that there are important connections between the broad international financial architecture, the role of development finance institutions, and the commercial financial sector, commercial banking, the non-bank financial institutions. And that, of course, comes through many channels, through regulations, through policies, for example, through monetary and exchange rate policy, the IMF engaging with the central banks on the continent. This will impact exchange rates, interest rates, and therefore the cost of finance, which is particularly important. But increasingly, we are also seeing these channels of influence via, for example, innovation, fintech solutions, and so on. And of course, we have a number of very well-known fintech solutions endogenously developed on the African continent, and M-Pesa and other mobile money applications are certainly quite well-known. If we take a look at the role of development finance in promoting both trade and industrialization, then I think there are some extremely interesting developments. In fact, Annalisa has mentioned a couple of those. But before I take a look at those, it is important to keep in mind that if we take a look at trade-led industrialization on an African continent that is diverse, with rather limited industrial capacity concentrated in a few of the large economies, and many, many countries having very little developed industrial or manufacturing capacity. So if we wait for trade-led industrialization, then this could be quite a long wait. It could be uneven, and in fact, many countries, the least developed countries, landlocked, small island developing states, may well be left behind. Therefore, an active industrial policy, which should link very proactively to finance and investment support and a range of interventions, becomes absolutely important. And it is in this context that we look, for example, at the role of development finance institutions, the multilateral development banks, but also in particular Africa's own regional development banks. If we take a look at industrialization and how it manifests, particularly for small and medium enterprises, then of course we recognize the importance of energy security, and digital infrastructure. So I'd like to say a little bit about energy infrastructure and also digital infrastructure. Now, in both cases, technology developments have meant that we have moved away from the necessity of the mega investment projects, the very large-scale utilities to provide these services, energy-related services, and digital services. And this requires that our development finance institutions be flexible, be innovative in terms of the mechanisms, the processes, the channels, but also in terms of partnerships with the private sector. So public-private partnerships are particularly important in this space. This is quite important in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The Protocol on Investment includes a commitment by the state parties specifically to promote investment in renewable energy production, generation, but also in the microgrids for transmission and distribution. So here, instead of the very large-scale projects that we're used to in water and transport infrastructure, we need to think very differently about what would serve the underserved communities, very often border communities, where in fact the infrastructure may well transcend those national geopolitical borders. In terms of digital infrastructure, and I think the same innovation impact is evident here, becomes particularly important if we take a look at satellite technology, which can bring connectivity, which provides access not only to economic opportunities, but very important to public goods, to social services, health and education. These low orbit satellites that we're finding increasingly used in developing countries can play a very important role. But here again, we need nimble development finance interventions and opportunities to bring in, to crowd in even smaller scale investors, the small and medium enterprises. And I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. Investment facilitation, this becomes another very important focus where we see connections to developments in the financial services sectors. We keep in mind, of course, that negotiations about what happens in terms of access to financial services is very much part of the trade in services agenda. And here, universal access to financial services does not feature prominently enough as an overarching objective when the member states negotiating the African Continental Free Trade Area are making their commitments to open, to liberalize, to reform regulations, and to make financial services access to a much broader community. The investment facilitation commitment, of course, in the World Trade Organization, we have a joint statement initiative, a plurilateral initiative, if you like, that has advanced quite far. In fact, 126 member states, including quite a number of African countries, are participating in the initiative. At the latest ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization earlier this year, it did not pass muster to become part of the World Trade Organization legal compact. However, in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have a strong commitment to promote investment facilitation. And this comes in terms of provisions to improve governance, transparency, administrative justice, the due processes, to really make investment processes easier, more accessible, accountable, and transparent. And I think this is particularly important because we often think commercial investments are a large-scale endeavor. This is not necessarily the only pathway. Small, medium enterprises may well be particularly important in terms of unlocking investment opportunities, but also taking up industrialization opportunities. These initiatives, both in terms of development finance, innovation developments, very important as they interface with what happens in the commercial financial space, if you like. It will be interesting to see if some of the developments that we see at regional economic community level, for example, in the East African community, where mobile money solutions are now incorporated into formal financial systems, whether this can gain traction, because this would make access to certain financial services, instruments, access to, for example, trade finance, letters of credit, and so on, perhaps far more accessible, because a major constraint very often for small-scale women traders, other small-scale traders, is collateral. Now, a small-scale woman trader who trades across a border post, sometimes multiple times a day, has a great deal of client information, a record of transactions on her mobile phone. This, I would argue, is collateral. And we're certainly hoping that the innovations in the financial sector across the continent will take up these opportunities to bring into the formal financial system to provide access to lower interest finance than they may be able to get from loan sharks, where often they may be borrowing on very short term. So to provide opportunity to participate in cross-border trade, but also in cross-border value chains. Thank you so much, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Trudy, and thank you very much to all of the panelists. For I think we heard a wide range of dysfunctions, but we also heard a wide range of solutions, how they can be addressed. So it's not a question that we are standing for an unsurmountable amount of problems, but rather that we are standing finding a way how to pick the solutions that are available and that are feasible. With that, I would like to open the floor for some questions, comments from the floor. And I think the best would be to address a few. It would be great if you try to balance them also across the wide range of issues. And then we make a short second round. I've seen we have been going a little bit over time, and I certainly don't want to take away your rather short lunch break that has been scheduled. With that, please raise your hand for your questions or comments. I see everyone is relatively shy or is relatively tired. If there's no much change in that, then maybe I would. Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Well, I am from Costa Rica, and I would like to thanks for organizing this day for the academia. Well, I would like to ask the panelists about their view concerning the potential role and challenges of green and blue bonds, as well as blend financing in order to boost policies and projects of the countries related to the accomplishment of the ODGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. And over there.
Yeah, my name is Mahongora Kabiuga from Namibia. Mine is on the issues of investments and Africa Free Trade Agreement, which is very silent on the issues of workers' rights and environmental rights. And we've seen that we're talking about financing for development, but if you go through various documents and various institutions, they are very silent on the issues of social protection, which we believe that if we don't center a human being around all what we want to do, it will be vain as we are experiencing now. Because we are living in a world that is highly characterized by inequality, and there is no indication that this gap is closing, except being widening. But you could see that all the presentations from academics, they are overlooking that component of placing a human being at the center. What is their take on that across all the presenters? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a third question here.
Thank you. I'm from the Maldives. I had a couple of questions. The first one was, how could new ideas such as debt forgiveness tied to climate resilience be effectively integrated into the broader financing for development framework in order to reduce the fiscal pressure in vulnerable countries while also incentivizing sustainable investments? And the second question was, what role should multilateral institutions play in ensuring creditor participation in financing for development? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And with that, I think we have 4 questions, and I think most of them were relatively broad, so several several panelists can certainly answer to them. And then we see already that we had the main panelists for today also arriving. So with that, Jose Antonio, of course, you're also most welcome. We did try already to address your main points on the overall financial architecture and the main dysfunctions. Welcome, Jose Antonio. Thank you for that. Let maybe then first go briefly to the four panelists, and then I will, of course, give you floor then to you to give some further remarks on your topics. And maybe we start this time in reverse order. We start with Trudy, because one of the questions was specifically on the point on the African trade agreement, and then Sakiko probably can answer in the same direction. Trudy.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you very much to Namibia for the question on the African Continental Free Trade Area. You are absolutely right. At the moment, there are still a number of very important development issues which are not incorporated in the African Continental Free Trade Area. So workers' rights, social clauses are not included, climate doesn't feature. Specifically, there's no climate protocol, and agriculture is treated under the broad trade in goods agenda, where, of course, agriculture and food security, many analysts are arguing, should have a very specific focus in this agreement. It is, however, important that we recognize that we can add new legal instruments as the state parties deem appropriate. So it could well come from Namibia to promote a discussion around the inclusion of worker and social rights, but also a much broader development agenda to address some of the issues which don't feature very prominently yet. I think we could also achieve quite important objectives through guidelines on implementation of the protocols. So another avenue, and this will be my final contribution here, is that the Council of Ministers may issue directives, regulations, and make decisions about particular issues, and that becomes part of the legal compact. So there are a range of avenues that we certainly would consider, and I would encourage Namibia and other countries on the continent certainly to take advantage of that opportunity to make the AFCFTA a development instrument for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trudy. Sakiko, maybe on the broader issue.
Yeah, I think most of the questions were on specific issues that weren't connected to what I was saying, except this comment about workers' rights. It's an incredibly important issue, which I am personally very involved in studying and researching and teaching about. But but I agree with you that there's a sort of a gap. The agenda on labor tends to be about creating jobs, not changing the quality of jobs. And I think that there's a sort of a dearth of mechanisms really being proposed. So that's something that we need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakiko. And maybe Liliana next.
Thank you. Just wanted to take one of the points raised by the importance of credit participation of the multilateral development banks. And here there is a point I would like to make, and the question is, what is the burden sharing between the private sector and the MDBs when there is an increase in the probability of default of any of these credits, being it in the form of direct credits or via loans? This is an issue that has been in the international community quite frequently raised these times by the private sector. And the problem that we're facing is that really the system that lacks a default resolution mechanism, which is essential to have a sustainable finance. The questions that arise are some like, for example, should there be haircuts on MDB loans in the case of defaults, or should the preferred status should all of the multilateral development banks and multilateral institutions in general should always be prevail? This is very important because for the private sector to enter on a sustained basis, you have to have very clear exit rules too. And so it's not been discussed in this panel, but the issue of default resolution scheme mechanism, I believe, is essential for sustainable finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liliana. Annalisa, maybe on the questions on climate financing.
Thank you so much also for the very thoughtful question, this very late time in your kind of early afternoon by now. So I would like to kind of pick up the kind of question that a colleague from Costa Rica raised around the potential of green and blue bonds. I can speak more around the kind of green bond side. And again, from the perspective of MDBs issuing green bonds, because we need to remember the ability of MDBs to lend and on lend is based on their capacity to place their own bonds in international capital markets. And there are a number of kind of examples, even of kind of issuance that were oversubscribed. So there is a great potential around that, even for market demand. And inevitably, there's also kind of an element of all that kind of financing being Paris aligned. So that kind of helps the mobilization and again, moving towards the climate targets that we've been discussing over the past, more intensively the past few weeks, but for a relatively long time. And I'll stop here for the sake of time, Matthias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annalisa. And then I would really use this opportunity to ask Jose Antonio Ocampo, he came maybe to give some more concluding remarks on the financial architecture that we may need to address the dysfunctions of the current system.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very nice to be able at least to arrive late. The responsibility of an airline that left me in London last night, not mine. And let me say that as a member of CDP, I was very happy to coordinate this task force that is presenting these recommendations for FFD4. And of course, I'm also working for FFD4 directly. The topic that I chose for my contribution for CDP is on the institutional architecture. And let me say in that regard, let's say three fundamental things. The first one is the issue of the voice and participation of developing countries in the Bretton Woods institutions, which implies not only that the capital contributions be up to date with the size of the economies, but also the importance of basic votes, which are very important for small and poor countries. The basic votes today in those institutions are about half of what they were when they were approved 80 years ago at Bretton Woods. So they could be doubled without any problem and will give a stronger voice to small and poor countries. And also in the case of the Bretton Woods, that there should be an open election of the heads of the institutions, that any citizen of a member country can participate in the process to avoid the tradition that the World Bank president is always a U.S. citizen and the IMF is always a European citizen. The second point is that we need new institutions in at least two important areas. The first one is debt restructuring or debt renegotiations, which we lack an institution, even a formal framework today to manage the over-indebtedness of about a third of developing countries, which is a major problem today. So this architecture could be, it could be in the United Nations, but could also be associated to the IMF, as it was tried early in the century, if and only if the decisions of the body that takes the final decisions on the debt restructuring are independent, totally independent of the board of the IMF. And the other is in international tax cooperation. international tax cooperation, there could be, there's a proposal to create a new institution, but the alternative is actually to use the current expert committee and transform it into an intergovernmental committee for international tax cooperation in the United Nations. By the way, this proposal was made by me when I was Under Secretary General of the UN. It was the rest of my proposals to upgrade that expert committee were approved, but not this transformation into intergovernmental process. And it was made also by the G77 in the Addis Ababa conference. In both cases, it was rejected by a minority of important countries, let's say that. So those two institutions, I think, have to be created, as part of the architecture to manage the many issues. And finally, the third issue is to create more regional institutions. Regional institutions have the basic advantage that developing countries feel that they are a stronger belonging, let's say, to those institutions, and they can provide, complementary or alternative or competitive financing to those of the global institutions. We do have that in the case of the system of multilateral development banks. But we need a similar structure for the international monetary system, which, aside from the IMF, we basically have two networks in the developing world, the Shanghai Initiative, which has actually not been used so far, and the Latin American Reserve Fund, which has been used quite actively. But the idea is to have a similar kind of institutions in all the regions of the developing world. And the other area in which we have also to have institutions is in international tax cooperation. So that aside from the global cooperation that hopefully will come out of the Convention of the United Nations, there could be actually dialogue among regional about countries in different regions to see what experiences they share among themselves, as well as what actions they can take together to avoid the basic problems of an international tax cooperation, which is the low taxation of the rich individuals and the unfair taxation of, or payment of taxes by multinationals, because they move their money in a way to avoid taxation, and sometimes don't pay a fair tax in the countries where they operate, either by producing or by selling their products. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. And I think with this, and we are slightly over time, but not too much. So with that, I would really thank everyone. I would thank the panelists for this very broad range of very far-reaching proposals, and would like to thank also the participants here and the participants online. And yes, would just like to thank you. And then, of course, we would like to hope to see that many of these proposals are somehow reflected in the outcome that will then come out of FFD4. With that, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.